Welcome to Research at Aromatica, episode 13. Today's presentation is titled The CITES Convention, International Regulations for Trade in Endangered Species and Their Implementation for Medicinal and Aromatic Plants. Today, we are privileged to be joined by Martin Hitziger. He is an environmental scientist and a decision scientist. As Associated Plant Species Officer in the scientific unit of the CITES Secretariat, he supports the implementation of CITES mandates and processes related to medicinal and aromatic species, such as African cherry, Agarwood, and orchids. He's also involved in the process for the recent working group set up on Boswellia. Previously, he held research positions in the field of medicinal plant species, intercultural public health, and transdisciplinary north-south collaboration at University of Zurich and ETH Zurich. Martin has fieldwork and intercultural facilitation experience in Colombia, Ecuador, French Guyana, Guatemala, India, Chad, and Tanzania. Welcome, Martin. It's great to have you here today.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good midnight for some maybe. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will immediately start the presentation.
Great, thank you.
So please, someone confirm that you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for your interest in this presentation. The CITES Secretariat was very happy that we were asked whether we could have such a presentation to your webinar at Research Aromatica. And we think it's a very important part of our job to also communicate our work and to communicate with industry sectors and stakeholders of species that are regulated by the CITES Convention. This presentation is relatively broad, especially in the beginning. I know that many of you will be interested in Boswellia and frankincense and aromatic species. I'm also aware that not everyone will be familiarized with the details of CITES regulation of international trade. This is why the presentation starts very broadly to familiarize you with our legal mandate and the processes that we use, and then becomes more specific to talk about the work that we are doing on aromatic and medicinal species. In this presentation, I will give you a very rough overview of global wildlife trade in any and all species. What is CITES and how does it work will be my second part. And in the third one, finally, I will go down to some details and current processes in CITES that relate to medicinal and aromatic plants, including Boswellia. Wildlife trade is maybe something that everyone has heard, but not everyone is quite aware of its scale and its details and characteristics. It can include many things. Food, for example, is a huge sector, and you can see seafood and wild meat and plant foods all meddled together here. Housing and furniture, or anything related to timber, is another big industrial sector that relies partially or entirely on wildlife trade. And health and beauty is certainly the sector that you are most obviously concerned with and maybe strongest interested in. And that can include pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, fragrances, and similar products. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a graph, though very small, that gives you a very, very rough overview of the relative values of these sectors over time from 1997 to 2016. And you can see that the largest economic sector that's relying on wildlife is by large degree seafood. Others are furniture and fashion, but then the next one down there, the yellow line, that's already traditional medicines. And well, other sectors are smaller in volume. So while certain sectors are incredibly important in terms of their perception, their value to certain groups of society or certain countries, and maybe incredibly important in order to sustain entire industry, in terms of monetary value itself and scale of trade, there is a clear reliance or a clear predominance of sectors that may not be the most well perceived and the most well recognized. And traditional medicines is certainly among those that are relatively large globally, especially in Asia, but also worldwide. Legal trade in CITES species. There is a database, and if you want to follow, you can follow this link to trade.cites.org that registers all transactions, legal transactions in international trade of species that are listed under the CITES Convention. There are by now 20 million transactions registered, and they concern many products that are worth millions or billions of dollars, including, again, seafood like queen conch, luxury goods like pythons, timbers like big leaf mahogany, and many others. The other side of it is illegal trade in CITES listed species, for which, for quite obvious reasons, we don't always have as detailed information as for legal trade. But illegal trade in this sense can involve any specimens whose trade are forbidden, prohibited by international laws, or specimens that could be lawfully traded, but they are not traded in accordance with CITES procedures for species that are listed in our conventions. That's what we consider illegal trade. And excluding the two largest sectors in wildlife trade that we saw are timbers and seafood, excluding those, we still estimate there's $20 billion per year in illegal trade in CITES listed species. So this is only to give you a notion of the scale and the problem that we try to address. And now we go to the more legal aspect. What is CITES and how does it work? CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, sometimes also called the Washington Convention, since it was signed in Washington, D.C. in 1973 and entered in force in 1975. By now, there are 37,000 species listed in the CITES appendices, and that implies that species listed in the appendices of our convention are regulated under the CITES legal provisions for international trade in these species. CITES is a multilateral agreement and constitutes an intergovernmental process. That means that the governments come together to agree and further develop the international regulations pertaining to the trade in species listed in the appendices of the CITES Convention. And as a legally binding instrument, something that's quite unique in the biodiversity arena, many of the provisions adopted by the parties of CITES in international conferences immediately and directly enter the legal bodies of text of its signature states. Some countries require additional adopting on national level or ratification on national level, but this is largely an automated process. In other countries, for example, species that CITES publishes on its website as being protected are immediately protected in these countries as well, since the website itself is considered an amendment of national legislation. Who is involved in CITES? We have 183 signatory parties, 182 of which are internationally recognized states. And additionally, we also have the party, which is the European Union. On a non-governmental level, there are multiple observers, stakeholders, which constitute anything from industry associations, sometimes individual companies, sometimes research institutions like universities, sometimes, yet again, international bodies in their own right, like IUCN, FAO, and many others. So this aspect of observers in CITES is a very broad one and a very large one potentially. In the end of the day, CITES is one of the very few conventions that has almost universal coverage. We are missing North Korea and a small handful of other states, mostly islands in the Pacific. Otherwise, we are relatively global. The vision, what is CITES trying to achieve? We are hoping and working towards trade in species that are listed in our appendices, that be legal in accordance to CITES provisions, that be sustainable in the sense that the trade is not detrimental to the populations of the species in the wild, and be traceable in the sense that the former two, the legality and the sustainability aspect, can be proved and tracked and traced back all the way to the origin of where the species has been harvested in the wild. This is what we try to achieve, and the next slides will go into more detail. The way how CITES is implemented is through nationally appointed scientific and management authorities who deliver permits and certificates, who testify that the legality and sustainability and traceability of the exported species or specimen or products is guaranteed. These certificates and permits are issued for certain products and specimen of the species that are listed in CITES. Not always all products. There is the small script to the legal provisions as well, but always in 4 cases. If those products are being exported from a country or imported to a country or re-exported from a country to which they had been imported before, or to which they are introduced from the high seas that do not pertain to any national jurisdictional area. So these are the 4 cases in which certificates and permits are required for trading products that contain specimen of species listed in CITES. These permits and certificates are meant to prove and record the 3 dimensions of relevance to the CITES vision, which is the origin and sourcing and the validity of the document itself, pertaining to the legality aspect of the trade. That refers to non-detriment findings, or in another way of saying this, sustainability assessments conducted by national authorities in the exporting country to make sure that the trade is non-detrimental to the populations in the wild. And those permits and certificates also contain trade data about the purpose, the quantity, the source, and other information that's used to enable the tracing back of specimens that are being exported or imported under CITES provisions. Our appendices, which I already mentioned, there are 3 of them, and they grant different levels of protection to the species that are being traded. The first one, and you see here a nice picture of Araucana from Chile, which is a tree in Chile, lists species who are considered to be threatened with extinction. So these are the serious cases, the ones that are already threatened and which require particular attention in order to ensure that any trade, if at all, is sustainable. The second, Appendix II, and you see here a nice medicinal plant from, I don't remember where, are species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction at the moment, but for which trade must be controlled because it has a scale that could threaten their survival in the future. So these are the gray cases, not necessarily already threatened, certainly not extinct, not necessarily required to already ban trade or reduce trade a lot, but there is a need for control and a need for sustainable management of the trade. and Appendix III, which is different in legal terms since it has another mechanism of how species are being listed in Appendix III. That it contains effectively plants or animals for which one single country decides that it needs international help for regulation of trade in these species. And it decides that it wants to control the monitoring. So Appendix III is not based on a global decision, it's based on a national country decision. And it has lesser degrees of regulation attached to it. So basically one can say from Appendix 1 to 2 to 3, the steps are of decreasing levels of protection for the species listed in them. What does this mean for trade? There are many different source codes. Trade in CITES terms can include any interaction of physical material across borders. That includes exchange for scientific purposes. That includes obviously commercial trade. That includes movements across borders of products that are being used, say instruments. So if an instrument contains wood that's being listed under CITES and the orchestra wants to go somewhere else in another country to have concerts there, that in itself would be considered as trade in CITES terms. But mostly, and in terms of international scale, we are obviously talking about commercial trade. For Appendix 1, commercial trade is generally prohibited, not saying that there couldn't be exceptions to that, but as a rule of thumb, Appendix 1 listed species can not be commercially traded or only under very tight circumstances. Appendix 2 and 3 generally permit trade. There is no general trade ban or trade suspension on species listed under Appendix 2 and 3. Quite to the contrary, we want to encourage sustainable trade since we think that it provides incentives to also protect and conserve and maintain the populations of those species in the wild. However, for species listed on those two appendices, trade needs to be controlled, and species-specific annotations regulate details for every single taxon. Most trade is permitted. So one of the impressions and perceptions that I'm trying to work against in this presentation is that we are just there to ban trade. That's not true. And as you can see in this slide, only 3% of species are listed in Appendix 1 for which trade is prohibited, but 97% are listed in Appendix 2 or 3 in which there can be legal commercial trade. It's allowed, it's even wanted. So trade in 97% of the species listed in our appendices can be legal while it is indeed controlled. CITES is known for compliance procedures since we are such a strong legalistic convention. It would go too far in this presentation to elaborate on compliance procedures. They also are not always perfect for sure. However, in the extreme cases, they can include trade suspensions in species from certain range states, either specific species or all species. There is a wide variety of consequences, but we do have trade suspensions against several countries at this moment. It's usually in the range of 10 to 20, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And by experience, these suspensions have usually often been strong incentives for these countries to become active in protecting the conservation and conserving their species in order to then also be able to reopen trade after a certain time. Now going towards the details of medicinal and aromatic plants like Boswellia, for which I know some of you or many of you will be here. In its current decision-making processes and current work streams at international level, we are working with about 30,000 plant species among the 37,000 that we work with in general. So there are 7,000 animals and 30,000 plant species. Most of them are traded as trees for timber or for medicinal or ornamental purposes. There are other sectors as well. But on the plant side, we mostly deal with timber, medicinal, ornamental plants. CITES decision-making often encourages science on these species, nomenclatural research, taxonomic research, research on the conservation of species, on population dynamics, on their reproduction, on how to artificially propagate it. The mere requirement of making trade legal and sustainable often stipulates rather intense research and rather intense international attention towards trade that's being considered under CITES. We have limited but existing possibilities to directly support fieldwork and implementation through international tools, such as a CITES tree species program, in which we can support scientific and management authorities in range states to better implement CITES provisions for tree species. In addition, so this is only a project run by the Secretariat of the CITES Convention. In addition, there are manifold activities at international level supported by specific states, by countries, by international overseas aid and overseas development agencies. There are manifold sources of funding for implementing this, but we also do have a few limited ones at the Secretariat. And we do have partnerships and synergies with many international actors, and sometimes can trigger work for the benefit of our forest portfolio simply by liaising and talking to and working with other institutions. If you see maps here, these are medicinal and aromatic plants, how we like to abbreviate them in CITES. So this slide is on what medicinal and aromatic plants are actually listed under CITES. And we have done a preliminary count and think that based on comparison with an extremely comprehensive database of plants used for medicinal purposes globally, that at least 1,280 of the species that are listed under CITES are being used for medicines in one or the other place for one or the other purpose, medical purpose. So not all of those are globally traded medications, but it's species that are used for medicine somewhere. That includes almost any aloe, cacti, or orchid or euphorbia that's used medicinally. There are many medicinally used orchids. There are many medicinally used euphorbia. There are some cacti. There are at least several aloes. And since all of these taxa, cacti, aloes, orchids, euphorbia are listed under CITES, it implies that also those ones that are used for medicine are listed under CITES. There are several species of use, taxospec. There's African cherry as something that's sometimes is considered a flagship species under CITES. There's Agarwood, which is big, especially in Asia. There's ginseng, which is big, especially in North America and parts of Russia, China. There's guayacum, which is big in South America. There's khatamansi, which is big in the Himalayan region. There's sandalwood that's big in India, and we could extend that list. So there are a number of relatively high-level medicinal or aromatic plant species in CITES. In total, more than 1,000. The legal trade in these species is considerable. According to a recent study, an analysis of our own database with all the interactions and trade exchanges registered that took place legally between 2006 and 2015, we think that at least 54,000 tons or 54 million kilogram of medicinal aromatic plant products that were regulated under CITES were traded during those 9 years. And quite distinctively, and in comparison to other sectors special, is that a lot of that, 50%, is being sourced from the wild. So in contrast to, say, timber, much of which is actually coming from plantations, or animal species, much of which are often coming from ranged sources. For medicinal and aromatic plants, wild collection is still a very common source, a large-scale source, and artificial propagation for harvest in these species is not very common and mostly limited to very few species. That means that trade in medicinal aromatic plants is still very directly linked to wild populations, and that this trade therefore can very immediately impact on wild populations if it was unsustainable. The illegal side of it is obviously a bit less clear, but we do have some data that points out that illegal trade in medicinal and aromatic plants is wide, large scale and common, and relatively large in comparison to other sectors that are being traded. For example, in 2 subsequent years, 2017 and 18, which are the latest that I have data access to, 25% of all seizures in the European Union that related to CITES listed species were actually medicinal and aromatic species, including animals. So 25% of all seizures of wildlife trade listed under CITES were concerned with medicinal products in the European Union. And in terms of absolute numbers, that was 500,000 items every year. Our current work on medicinal and aromatic plants derives from a number of decisions taken at the last Conference of Parties in 2019 in Geneva. And we are working on an updated overview to improve the data basis on which we are actually assessing trade. We are working on sustainable and traceable supply and value chains. We are working on better integrating local and traditional knowledge in our work, in our assessments, sustainability assessments and otherwise, in species management or monitoring. There are several overview documents for which there are also hyperlinks on this page, and you could follow those if you want, and if you are interested to actually get to the details of the written text. And we do various lines of species-specific work, including on Boswellia spec. And I'm now going to focus on Boswellia in my next slide. Currently, and that's maybe the most important information I can convey today in terms of Boswellia, it is not regulated under CITES. It's not listed in the appendices, and CITES has not and does not intend to ban trade in frankincense. There are, though, decisions derived from the last Conference of Parties to consider trade in Boswellia without regulating it, only gathering information. And this information collection has been ongoing and is continuing in order to understand better whether or not Boswellia species would potentially meet CITES listing criteria in the future. This work is ongoing. It's actually ongoing at this very moment. And we can say from the Secretariat that we were quite surprised by the number of submissions we got, by the level of information that we were given. We have to say that there are many species listed under CITES for which we know less than we know about Boswellia at this very moment. And we were surprised and also, well, interested to see how much attention these decisions that were merely on information collection, not on regulation and not on any legal decision, how much attention that has actually caused worldwide. Currently, we have published extensive information as far we have it available, and we have some initial synthesis of that information prepared and published. And this very moment ongoing are the discussions to assess that information and within the CITES governing bodies to decide how and which recommendations would be formulated to the next Conference of the Parties that will take place in about 1 year. but also how CITES work on Boswellia would continue after that conference of the parties. So this is ongoing. No decisions are being made, and about the ongoing process, there is also not much I can tell you publicly. However, CITES is in the process of considering that trade. It's not in the process of banning that trade. And we do think that this work will already be fruitful to the sustainable use of Boswellia in the future to some degree, whether or not it will ever be listed under CITES. It's important to understand that even the recommendations being done at this step are not necessarily able, even capable, to lead to a listing proposal per se. Listing proposals can only be submitted by CITES parties, and whatever recommendation is being formulated at this moment, it can only lead to a listing if there is a listing proposal by a party. That is important to understand, and we have the impression that sometimes these details were not well understood in the global audience. With this, I come to the conclusions of my introductory talk, and I think we will have plenty of time for questions and discussions afterwards. So bringing it all together, CITES is an intergovernmental agreement on international trade in wild flora and fauna. We are overseeing the legality, traceability, and sustainability of trade in those species that are listed on the appendices. CITES is a legal framework and a set of procedural mechanisms to guarantee those three dimensions: legality, traceability, and sustainability. And it operates through a system of permits and certificates managed by parties. Medicinal and aromatic plants are often still wild collected, not so much artificially propagated. Many are listed under CITES, and they are intricately linked to other work that CITES does on forests in general terms. They are obviously also intricately linked to completely different topics that CITES usually doesn't work at all on: public health, etc. Medicinal and aromatic plants are among those commodity classes with very high trade value and volume that are partially regulated under CITES. And we can state that in the last years, many medicinal plant species such as Boswellia, but also overarching topics like traditional knowledge, have gained more attention under CITES, and it currently seems that this attention will keep growing for the foreseeable future. If you want to follow more information and to get more information, there are several options to do that you can take. One is to follow all the hyperlinks on previous slides or in the handout that you are being made available. Two, here in this very slide, I have posted you 3 links to our original databases, the appendices, a checklist where you can check whether and under what exact regulation species are being traded under CITES, and a very similar database that's called Species Plus, where you have access to a lot of legal documentation on top. If you want to have very concrete hands-on information how to export or how CITES is implemented in your state, in your country, you can contact your national CITES authorities, a list of which you can find under the hyperlink on this slide as well. And if you want to find many or almost any original legal text at the international level, so not your national legal legislation, but the international basis upon which your national legislation is based, then you can find that on the website of the CITES Secretariat, also hyperlinked to this slide. I thank you for your attention, and I believe we still have plenty of time for discussion, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. We definitely have a good solid 20 minutes, and we do have plenty of questions. So I'm just going to jump right in. This question comes up a lot, and I've myself been asked this, so I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to ask you. in the specific case of Boswellia in Somaliland, Somalia, is under a trade suspension, and Somaliland is not currently internationally recognized as a separate country. Does this mean that any listing, even Appendix 2 or 3, of a species occurring in Somaliland would function as a de facto trade ban?
No. It's not that easy. Under Appendix 3, there is very little regulation, and Appendix 3 listings would usually only occur if the range state itself asks for that listing. So in that sense, it would be Somalia asking for listing in Appendix 3. So an Appendix 3 listing of a species in Somalia is very unlikely in the first place, unless another range state suggests that. Furthermore, Appendix 3 is not so much a regulation of trade, it's more a data collection. It means that there is certain formulations and certain documents to be filled to make the trade traceable, but it's effectively an information collection mechanism in which countries are required to monitor the levels of trade without regulating them. So Appendix 3 in that sense is certainly is under no circumstances, as far as I can tell, a trade suspension. For Appendix 2 listing,
and that would be the same for 2?
No, for Appendix 2 listing, it's a bit different. There's usually required that national authorities, so that in Somalia, because Somalia is the party to CITES, not Somaliland, would need to issue permits and certificates required for exports from Somaliland, and we understand that this could be complicated. Nevertheless, there are many options around, and that includes listing on regional basis, listing of only certain species, etc. So there's no immediately direct link, but it is a fact that there are possible consequences of that, yes.
Okay. And Stephen, since you asked that question, if that's clear enough, or if you have any clarifying questions, please pop it in the chat. And I just want to say, if we don't get to your question today, Martin has offered to write a written response. We keep track of these questions, and then we would make that available to all of you who've attended. So your question will get answered, whether it's today or in written format in the days to come. Hussein asks, last week at the 25th CITES Plant Committee, Canada was not keen, if I understood correctly, on supporting working groups based on products stemming from concerned CITES species, only on the species themselves. Canada made this point based on the regulatory text itself. According to you, what does that mean when we're looking at frankincense resin, not wood, or at frankincense agarwood oils, again, not wood, which are not the species themselves being traded, but rather the products stemming from them? Did I hear Canada's position correctly? Please enlighten me.
I cannot tell you details of ongoing discussions before they have been published on the CITES website. So I need to refer you to the executive summary of the CITES meetings once they are being published. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. We have, let's see. Shabazz asks, what were the USA's wildlife and fisheries concerns when they started the Boswellia process in 2018?
The concerns that were starting this process, as far as we can tell, are outlined in the documents that were submitted to the Conference of the Parties. And they stem from the quickly growing scale of trade in Boswellia worldwide since around 10 years. They stem from various reports in at least some range states that point towards challenges in the sustainable use and the conservation of Boswellia species in those range states. And I understand the combination of those two factors, growing trade and growing concern about the populations in at least some range states, coupled with possibly other threats to those species like climate change, overuse, over forest fires, soil degradation. It's not saying that trade is the only one or at all an important driver of the poor conservation state of Boswellia in some range states, but the documents as submitted to the Conference of Parties suggest that at least there could be possible concern, and this should be assessed further.
Great. And Shabazz, any other clarifying question there? Go ahead and pop it in the chat. Next question is, CITES traditionally has made decisions on appendix listing strictly on environmental criteria without taking into consideration the social and economic impacts of the decision to list. Does CITES believe this is realistic and ethical, and is there any way to involve impact on communities such as bans?
There is a resolution adopted by the Conference of the Parties that specifies listing criteria, and those are based on scientific information on the conservation and population status of the species we discussed. There is a very basic fundamental underlying rationale that species that are being extinct are for livelihoods of local communities. That is true. That notwithstanding, there are several work streams under CITES to make trade useful to local communities and to local livelihoods. We have a local livelihoods project. We are collecting case studies of best practices. We have guidances to make trade beneficial to local communities, to establish regulation that involves local communities. We have currently ongoing discussions on how CITES assessments can draw on local knowledge and local understanding of local situations in order to reflect local situations appropriately in CITES decision making. So there are manifold streams of work in trying to address potential livelihood impacts of CITES decisions.
Great, thank you. Can you clarify wild sourced? Does this mean treating naturally or publicly in a community plan or private land? So can you clarify wild sourced?
For CITES, everything is wild sourced that is not derived from a non-wild source. So what I can define is the non-wild sources. There is a range of about 10 to 20 source codes under CITES, and for plants there are mostly 3 different kinds of source codes that are relevant in this discussion. There are a few more, but they are minor and not of that general importance. 1 is wild, 2 is artificially propagated, and for that we have very clear definitions of what can count as artificially propagated specimen or specimen derived from artificially propagated stocks. That relates to how the stocks are being grown, how they are being propagated, and also where their seeds or propagules are coming from. So given these criteria that are very well elaborated, and given those are found to be met by the national scientific authorities or management authorities in the countries in which the species, the plants are being harvested, they can qualify as artificially propagated, and that implies a different kind of regulation of international trade for these specimens. The third important source codes for plants is sort of an intermediate one. It's assisted production. And this is the gray zone by definition. It's not meeting necessarily the criteria for artificial propagation, but the specimen were derived from a production scheme, a production method that, while not meeting the definition of artificially propagated, it is still taking place under substantial assistance of human interventions. And here it's a very new source code. It's not yet very well defined, and it's not yet counting with all the guidance and all the criteria that we do have for artificial propagation. So basically what I'm saying is that usually wild can be on public lands, it can be on private lands, as long as it doesn't meet the criteria for either artificial propagation or assisted production. And for assisted production, we are currently in the process of elaborating detailed criteria, but they do not necessarily exist at this moment.
Great, that was a good clarification of that. Next question from Dr. Bongers. Can Appendix III species be controlled from one country while not from another? For example, species that cover a few countries but are not under threat in all.
Yes, that is definitely the case. It's, by the way, sometimes also the case that we do have regional listing for other appendices, but certainly for Appendix III, it can be the case that species are being controlled if derived or if being exported from certain range states, but not from others.
Great, okay. Will African range state parties be sought out to be fully represented as part of this working group? The working group on Boswellia, I'm assuming.
Again, I'm not entitled to talk specifically about ongoing discussions in ongoing meetings, but in general terms, CITES working groups are assembled by chairs of the plants, in this case, the plants committee, and they do follow some rules regarding regional representation and balance. So yes, I can confirm that range states of Boswellia are fully involved in these discussions. They are well represented and they have all the rights to participate. It's obviously then up to them to take that right and to make use of that possibility.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the support that's provided to developing countries? You mentioned some of the mechanisms that you have to support, and this is a question specifically from Nepal. Would like to understand the support provided in developing countries.
The support is manifold. And again, I would stress that a lot of support is not offered through the Secretariat, but through other international bodies and venues in the context of overall development collaboration, overall intergovernmental capacity building and technical transfer of technical skills and technical equipment. So the support directly through the Secretariat is very small in scale, but very well focused on two aspects. The first one is support in implementing from a legal perspective and ensuring and supporting countries in compliance with the decisions that have been taken at the Conference of the Parties. We have a compliance assistance program that can provide parties with technical assistance, with directly in-person support if necessary in the range state where required. We have lots of guidances, lots of support mechanisms in order to explain and understand and support the countries in implementing their work. The CITES III species program that I was referring to is a very specific avenue of supporting national scientific authorities in actually doing operational work in the field. To, for example, do inventories, population assessments. This is a relatively small scale in terms of volume, but it has proven quite useful for a range of tree species to enable range states to do operational work in the field that directly supports the implementation of CITES. It has also been concerned with genetic studies of different species. There have been xylaria, like wood herbaria, wood libraries of wood examples that would facilitate identification of wood products. In this sense, there can be very directly operational activities in range that be supported under the CITES III species program.
Great. Okay. I'm only going to give you maybe 2 more questions since we're getting close to time and you're being very generous with your time. Does CITES, you touched on this a little bit, does CITES take into account the potential negative environmental effects on the species of removing it? from economic incentives to protect the trees from grazing, charcoaling, etc. Are those things taken into account when moving towards a decision for a listing?
Do I understand correctly that the question is whether the impacts of reduced trade would be taken into account, right?
Yes.
That's the question.
Yes.
We are trying to get better at that. Again, the scientific criteria for listing are concerned with scientific information about the conservation status and of populations in the wild. However, there are considerations about what's the best approach to take for a species. And removing trade incentives certainly is one of those considerations that can be taken into account.
Okay. Are CITES authorities promoting cultivation of CITES listed species? The question assumes that it isn't, because it's framed why CITES authorities are not promoting cultivation of CITES listed species. So are you or aren't you?
On an international level, the CITES Secretariat is not explicitly supporting any activities for the cultivation. On a national level, the national authorities in many ways have their own policies, and in many ways there are national legislations that can be going beyond international provisions. So CITES is not against trade in cultivated species or artificially propagated species, as we call it. It's though not the case that we are actively trying to push it either at the international level. On a national level, I'm aware of cases and instances in which national governments, and I'm not aware in how far national CITES authorities were involved in that specifically, are pushing for cultivation for economic purposes, but also in order to reduce pressure on specimen from the wild, which has potentially very, it's a spirit with two sides. It can have positive or negative effects. So no, there is no specific policy to support artificial propagation in particular, but we know that at national level and looking at it in the long perspective over decades, that artificial propagation and non-wild sources of CITES listed specimen have grown in relevance in international trade streams. That's a fact.
Great. Okay, so last question. I'm going to combine two because we have two questions that are somewhat similar. Just to clarify, let's take Ethiopian Boswellia. If that was listed, if just Papyrifera was listed, would that affect the other species in the genus that are not as endangered? How does that work? Is this by species or is this by genus?
It could be either. We have genera listed under CITES, including not even genera. We have families. We have orders listed under CITES. For example, the entire family of orchids. Just to give you one example. So there can be general listings. There can be species listings. That is part of a decision that would be made by a conference of parties when deciding about listing any species.
Great. Let me just check. I think we're at time. So thank you so much, Martin. That was a lot of questions we threw at you. And like I said, there might be a couple questions in there that didn't get answered. We will go through that and make sure that we make those answers available. Thank you everyone for attending today. This was incredibly informative. This did exactly what we were hoping to do, is to have a discussion about the facts of the process of implementation of CITES. So thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Research Aromatica. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, and go to our website, look at the documents that will be published about ongoing meetings, and use the hyperlinks that I provided you if you're interested in that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So to keep on top of this, you guys, in the files is the handout with all the hyperlinks. Okay, have a great day.
Bye.